So, one of the things that makes the book of Esther unique in all of Scripture is not once does it even mention God. Much like Ruth, there are no burning bushes, there are no pillars of fire, there are no angels showing up with messengers from heaven, there are no seas splitting in two. So if we're looking for obvious signs of God's activity, Esther would seem like a strange place to find them. And yet, generations of believers have looked to this story and they have seen God's fingerprints all over it. Because perhaps, again, like Ruth, it's because Esther looks a lot more like our lives than the story of the Exodus does, right? What we have experienced are those moments that seem ordinary at the time. Chance meeting, an unexpected conversation, a job opportunity, a move across the country, a friendship, a disappointment, even a tragedy that years later becomes the very thing that we realize God is now using that to help shape us. And looking backward, we sometimes discover that what appeared to be coincidence sometimes is actually providence. Both Ruth and Esther teach us to see God's activity there, in the ordinary, seemingly random circumstances of everyday life. And Esther's life is full of those moments. Before we can appreciate her courage in chapter 4, we need to remember how she got to where she is. So if you aren't overly familiar with the story of Esther, this is not a fairy tale. And this is not a royal romance, despite what, if you've ever seen the movie One Night with the King, that's really not what happened. In fact, it begins with one of the more absurd and disturbing stories in the Bible. King Xerxes, the king of the Persian Empire, they overthrew the Babylonians, and they now rule over the empire. He throws a lavish drinking party that lasts for several days. And by the end of it, he is thoroughly intoxicated and decides he wants to show off his queen Vashti before all of his drunken friends. Text doesn't tell us exactly what he expected, but Jewish tradition has long suggested that he wanted her to appear wearing her crown and only her crown. But whatever the case, Vashti refuses. And suddenly the king has another problem. His advisors begin to panic. If word gets out that the queen told the king no, what will happen throughout the empire? What if other wives start saying no? The horror. So they kind of wring their hands, and their solution is, well, we need to get rid of Vashti. Depose Vashti and issue an empire-wide decree that every man should be the master in his own house. Now, it's meant to kind of be over the top, right? And the Jewish readers have long understood the opening chapters as satire, poking fun at the fragile egos of very powerful men. But beneath that humor lies something that is very deeply tragic. Because after removing Vashti, Xerxes needs another queen, right? How does he go about this? It's not like Cinderella. There isn't just this lovely ball that happens where he gets to dance with them and decide. Officials are sent throughout the empire to collect beautiful young women. They are not invited, they are taken. They are not volunteering, so they are not there by choice. They are gathered into the king's harem, where each woman spends a night with the king before returning to live permanently among the king's concubines, unless he chooses her to become the queen. This is a very state-sponsored exploitation, and Esther did not choose the life that she is now living. She did not pursue the crown. She did not climb the social ladder. She was a young Jewish orphan living in exile who was swept up into a system designed entirely for the pleasure and power of one man. She wasn't cleverly maneuvering herself to become the queen. She was just trying to survive. So let's be clear. When we talk about God's providence, that does not require pretending that evil things are not still evil. That God did not ordain the exploitation of women. God did not will the violence of empire. But the remarkable witness of Esther is that even human evil cannot prevent God from bringing forth life. The very system that sought to use Esther becomes the place from which God is going to now save God's people once again. Because here in chapter 4, one of the king's highest officials, Haman, becomes enraged because Mordecai, who is Esther's cousin who raised her when her parents died, refuses to bow before him. His wounded pride becomes a genocidal rage. It's going to destroy all the Jewish people. So rather than punishing one man, Haman manipulates the king into approving the extermination of an entire people. The book of Esther is crisis literature. It was written for Jewish people living with the constant fear that their existence could disappear at the whim of another empire. And sadly, that fear has never completely disappeared, from the Roman destruction of Jerusalem to the expulsions throughout Europe to the Holocaust. Hatred built on scapegoating and fear is never as far away as we would like to believe. And into that crisis, Mordecai sends Esther an impossible request. Go before the king, speak for your people, and risk your life. Now, you got to remember who this king is, right? This is the same king who banished one queen for publicly defying him, right? Now Mordecai is saying, go publicly defy the king. Esther knows exactly what happened to Vashti, and she also knows the law. Anyone who approaches the king without being summoned can be executed on the spot, unless the king extends his golden scepter. She has not been summoned for over 30 days. And there's something else. Up until this point, Esther has hidden the fact that she is Jewish. Esther is her Greek name. It is not her Jewish name. Mordecai instructed her to keep her identity secret. So only is she going to defy the order, she's going to reveal she is part of this group of people. So she walks into the throne room uninvited, and the same royal officials who once worried that women might be a little too independent are watching. And then she reveals, I'm the one of the people Haman wants to destroy. That is why Mordecai's words become so powerful. Who knows, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. He doesn't say, God told me this is what you're supposed to do. He doesn't say, an angel appeared to me and said, this is what you need to do. He simply looks back over Esther's life through the eyes of faith. A dismissed queen, a frightened orphan, a royal harem, a crown she never wanted, a crisis no one expected. Could God have been quietly working throughout all of this? Perhaps. Those who canonize the Hebrew Scriptures certainly believed so, because faith isn't always certainty. Faith is learning to recognize God's hidden providence in hindsight. And the remarkable thing is that Mordecai doesn't tell Esther she was blessed for her own sake. This echoes one of the oldest promises in Scripture. When God called Abraham and Sarah, God blessed them with a purpose. I will bless you so that you will be a blessing. God's gifts are never simply for our own comfort. She did not come to become the queen just so she could bask in all the royal fineries. They are entrusted to us for the sake of others. They were entrusted to her for the sake of others. Esther never chose her position. She never asked for this influence. But once she had it, she had to decide what she was going to do with it. So the question wasn't how she got there. The question was whether she would use the position she had to serve others. And the same question confronts us. None of us choose every circumstance in our lives. Some of us have inherited opportunities. Some of us have inherited wounds. Some occupy positions of influence we never expected. Others carry burdens they never deserved. But like Esther, we don't always choose our circumstances. What we can choose is what we do with them. Will our education become a blessing? Will our resources become a blessing? Will our voice become a blessing? Will our position become a blessing? And yes, can we even take our tragedy and turn it into a blessing? Because faith isn't merely recognizing God's providence. Faith is responding when God's providence gives us an opportunity to act. And that's what Esther does. The young woman who has spent much of the story being acted upon now begins taking action herself. She gives instructions, she organizes a fast, and she takes ownership of the moment. And then she speaks one of the bravest lines in all of Scripture. If I perish, I perish. If I die, I die. But I'm going to do this. In this way, she's a forerunner to what Jesus, of course, will do. Because the gospel reaches its fulfillment in that same pattern. Jesus steps into danger for the sake of others. And he uses his position not for self-preservation, but for the salvation of not just those he loves, but for the entire world. But Jesus doesn't simply risk death. He willingly embraces it, because there is no if I perish for Jesus. Jesus knows his actions will get him killed. And through his death and resurrection, God defeats the power of sin and hatred and violence and death itself. The good news of Esther is not simply that God occasionally raises up extraordinary heroes. It's that God is already at work in the ordinary, in the messy, in the complicated lives of just ordinary people. And sometimes through circumstances we would have never chosen. Sometimes through positions we never sought. The question is, when our moment comes, will we have the courage to answer God's call? To act when we see injustice? To speak up even when we know it could cost us everything? For who knows? Perhaps we are where we are for such a time as this. Confident that God does act on our behalf, I